I guess the first question is kind of a basic one.
Sure.
Okay. What is the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
I believe that ultimately the two-state solution is the most viable answer to the problem that we face today. Benny Morris, the Israeli historian, has compared the situation in Palestine and Israel today to the partition of India at about the same time, and the earlier exchange of populations between Greeks and Turks in the Balkan Wars. He makes the point that if there had been a more complete separation of the parties, there wouldn't be as much conflict today. But given the presence of Arabs in what they call Palestine, what I would call the land of Israel, then, and of course they're human beings and they have rights. So a two-state solution is ultimately the best, but it does demand that the Palestinians recognize legitimacy of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, just as Palestine is intended to be the homeland of the Palestinian people.
Where is recognizing legitimacy in international law?
I don't claim to be an expert in international law, but if you want this problem to be solved, that's what is demanded. And the reason is this. At the present time, the Palestinians regard the Israelis as conquerors, as imperialists, as outsiders. And the majority of Palestinians regard the two-state solution as merely a prelude to the conquest of Israel, to the creation of one state in which the Palestinians would be a majority. And perhaps the more fundamental question is, why does a Jewish state have legitimacy? And the answer is, almost every state in the world has an ethnic basis. Italy is an Italian country, China is a Chinese country, and the fact that these countries have minorities doesn't change the fact that they are nation states, states for nations or peoples.
Don't you think that Israel and the United States keep on, in a way, upping the ante for what they require to accept? First, Israel required that they just accept their existence, and in November 1988, the Palestinian National Council acknowledged the United Nations regarding the conflict two-state solution. And then all of a sudden, in 1988, that's when we first get what Israel and the United States said they wanted to accept, not only their existence, they wanted to accept their legitimacy. All of the Palestinian leadership now, they accept Israel's existence. They accept the two-state solution. Why keep on upping the ante and saying, okay, now you not only have to accept our existence, you have to accept our legitimacy? Isn't that asking them too much? Isn't that asking the Arabs to say, okay, we recognize the legitimacy of you uprooting us from our homeland in 1948, and don't you think that's just an excuse not to negotiate?
It would be better if the Israeli position would remain consistent, but Israel is a democracy, and the government does change hands. And within Israel, there are differences of opinions, nuances of opinions about how to approach negotiations. But
they accept their existence, though. They accept Israel.
That is actually not true. You are ignoring Hamas, for example, which is very open about its genocidal anti-Semitism. And you're ignoring a great deal of evidence. I would recommend to you and to your listeners Palestinian Media Watch to find many, many examples where the Palestinian Authority rejects the existence of Israel. The problem is that what you find Palestinian leaders saying in English to international audiences can be quite different than what they say to their own people, what they teach their own people, what they propagandize to their own people in Arabic. That's a problem which isn't sufficiently accepted. You cannot take at face value what Palestinians say in English. You must look deeper.
Well,
now let me answer your question. Is it a legitimate demand to recognize Israel's legitimacy? And the answer is yes. To begin with, I don't accept the claim, the fundamental claim, that Israel drove out the Palestinians. That strikes me as false. But the reason legitimacy matters more here than perhaps in other international conflicts is because in other international conflicts the question just doesn't arise. Israel is virtually the only country in the world whose legitimacy is questioned, regularly questioned by many, many people throughout the world, and particularly in the Arab and Muslim world. And that's why, in order to really end the conflict, that has to be established. Otherwise, you either have no end to the conflict, or the conflict ends without there being an Israel.
There's two things. Like I said, the ante seems to go up every time the Palestinians or the surrounding Arab states
do make success. And it's a good point. So here's the answer to that question.
Oh, just real quick. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
The answer is, I don't think Israelis appreciated early on enough the fact that the Oslo process was being engaged in by the Palestinians without recognizing their legitimacy. It's pretty clear in retrospect that Arafat used that process to get as much as he could to return to Palestine, to establish a government in Ramallah, to establish control over Gaza and the West Bank, get as much as he could, and then revert to warfare, to the Second Intifada. So I think the reason you didn't see that earlier is because Israelis were too naive about what the Palestinians were after. And now, saddened and wiser, it becomes clear that this demand for legitimacy is absolutely essential to achieving a genuine peace between these peoples.
A lot of people think that Oslo and Oslo II gave a lot of concessions. The Palestinians gave a lot of concessions. They almost legitimized the illegal settlements that Israel was building in the West Bank. Another thing regarding the Second Intifada in September 2000, that was caused just because when Ariel Sharon visited the Temple of the Mosque, people protested, some kids threw rocks, and then they started shooting, and that was what sparked it. But just going back to Hamas real quick, Hamas, all the leaders of Hamas publicly, Ismail Haniyeh, Mohammed al-Zahar, Sami Zuri, Khalid Michel, Ghazi Hamid, all the top leadership of Hamas have advocated the two-state settlement. The two-state settlement, by definition, recognizes Israel's existence. The two-state settlement also is accepted by the international community. The only people who don't accept the two-state settlement is the United States and Israel and some islands. If you go to the General Assembly every year it's the same vote. Israel and the United States on one side and the whole world on the other side. And just going back to that
exactly backwards. Israel has accepted the two-state solution, and it did in 1947 when it welcomed the United Nations General Assembly vote recommending partition. And this is what's a little hard to understand, but isn't critical to understand. There is no two-state solution with a right of return for the Palestinians to Israel. Okay? And the fact that the Palestinian Authority's negotiating stance insists on this right of return, not to Palestine, not to the new state, but to their, quote, original homes, shows their bad faith. This is a really critical point. That's why the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is an anti-Israel movement. This needs to be clear. There are millions upon millions of descendants of refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere. If they return to Israel rather than to the Palestinian state, the Jewish character of the Jewish character of Israel ends, because Israel is a democracy, and it can only remain a Jewish state if it has a Jewish majority, a Jewish supermajority. That's why the demand for for a right of return is in bad faith.
Okay.
The claim that the majority of the world and the Palestinians and the Arabs are in favor of a two-state solution isn't true, is false, as long as they demand a right of return.
Well, the right of return, as you know, the right of return is outlined in Resolution 194, but you do know that a lot of even Palestinian leaders like Mahmoud Abbas and Erdogan, they all claim that can be negotiated out, maybe through some kind of compensation, but the actual right of return to Israel proper can be negotiated out. Regarding the two-state solution and who accepts that and who denies that, I usually start at 1967 because that's when a lot of the current, in my opinion, mess happened in 1967 after that. In 1976, that was the first time that the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution brought by Syria and Egypt and Jordan that called for the two-state settlement. The United States vetoed it, and then they vetoed a similar one in 1981. Since around 1973, 1974, after the Yom Kippur War, it's been the United States and Israel that's been the ones and it's all on record, all in the General Assembly, that's been against a two-state settlement, not the rest of the world. You got Fatah, who's for it. You got the PLO, who declared that they were for the two-state settlement as early back as November 1988, and accepted UN Resolution 242 and 338, which Israel and the United States have not accepted. I think that's where the problem lies. The world on one side and the United States and Israel on the other side. Just look at the General Assembly resolutions, and you can see the world stacked up on one side against the U.S. and Israel.
There was a period roughly from 1977, when Likud first became the government of Israel, until the early 90s, when the Oslo process began, when Israel did reject a two-state solution. Right. There was no negotiating partner. Arafat and the PLO was a terrorist organization, as it still is, frankly.
You still think they're...
I'm certainly going to concede... Sorry, let me just finish this point. I'm going to concede those 10 to 15 years when Israel did oppose, when the government did oppose a two-state solution. That has nothing to do with the last 20 years.
Yeah, again, I just think you should look at the General Assembly resolutions, and you should see...
I don't have those resolutions in front of me. I'd be happy to look at them. But let me go back to that.
Yeah.
It isn't. I mean, let me start with this. Yes,
well, what do you think should be done with
194? Negotiate on. It's the Palestinians who regard the right of return as a sacred right. Mm-hmm. And again, you need to understand the difference between what they say in English and what they tell their own people. They claim the right of return is a sacred right when they get into, and if they really wanted peace, they would tell their own people, look, you will never, ever go back to Haifa. You will never see Jaffa except as a tourist. That's what you say to people if you want to have peace with Israel.
So what should...
Let me just say one more thing. The Palestinians have never made a serious effort to prepare their people for the real compromises that peace, a two-state peace, would require.
Well, I think they have. If you look at the original partition line of November 1947 with 181, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is 22% what it was. It was, as you know, 45%. Now it's only 22%. So they've made huge concessions just since then. And I think even with Oslo, they made huge concessions, allowing the legitimacy of illegal settlements that Israel built in the West Bank. What do you think should be done? Well, let me ask you this. What do you think should be done with Resolution 194? Do you think that should just be ignored and just thrown out the window?
Here's the story. In 1948, the Arabs started a war and lost. And there are consequences to losing wars. In 1967, the Arabs started another war and lost. There are consequences to losing wars. That's the first thing that needs to be said. As for the actual refugees, there's something very important that I want to explain. There are some refugees, elderly people who left in 48. Their children, under international law, are not refugees. There has been an exception carved out for Palestinians and their descendants to give them perpetual refugee status in order to create a weapon to use against the Jewish state. How this happened needs to be explored, but we can't do it right now. The point is, In every other part of the world, refugee population people settle where they are, and their descendants become citizens of where they have settled. Only among the Palestinians have you got a population where the Palestinians and the Arabs that host them refuse to let them out of the refugee camps, to keep them in these squalid positions in order to keep them resentful against Israel. So the answer is the Palestinians are welcome to go to a Palestinian state if one is created. The fact that there's a continuing refugee situation in Jordan and in Syria and Lebanon is an intolerable reproach against the Arabs. Those camps should be disbanded. Those folks should be offered citizenship in the countries where they live. The discrimination against them by other Arabs should cease.
Okay. Just a few points. Article you mentioned about how the wars are lost, so gains are made by the victor. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter says land can't be acquired by force. Well, no, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Now, I'm glad you mentioned UN Resolution 242 says the same thing. The preamble says, emphasizing the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war and the need of work for a lasting peace. It says basically that you can't acquire land by force. That's the old Hitler way of, the winner gets all the spoils of war. That's not how the world works since the United Nations was created. In fact, one of the reasons the UN was created in 1945 is to stop territory being won by force. So Israel can't claim territory by force. It's double against international law. It not only goes against the UN Charter, which Israel is compelled to accept, even granting their existence in 1948, but it also goes against a host of UN Security Council resolutions. So Israel is in double violation of international law there. Just real quick about the Palestinians are welcome to go to a Palestinian state.
Oh, wait, I do want to talk about that, but let me just answer the point you just made quickly.
Sure.
I think that interpretation is a mistake, and what ought to be, and perhaps it is true of international law, is that the acquisition of territory is inadmissible through aggression. I believe that when one state attacks another, perhaps it ought to lose territory. There ought to be a penalty for waging aggressive war.
What Security Council resolution says that? Or where in the UN Charter does it even remotely say anything close? I am expressing
my opinion. I am not, as I said, an expert on international law. It may be as you say. If it is, that would be, I think that would be a mistake.
Well, that is what Israel is compelled to accept, is it not? Doesn't the UN Charter say that all member states have to abide by the UN Charter?
Well, of course. But then the question arises, why is there no criticism of all the Arab wars of aggression against Israel?
Like which ones, for example?
1948, 1967, 1973.
1967 was a preemptive strike by Israel.
There is no rational claim that was not a war of the Arab states against Israel.
Well,
the fact that Israel struck in self-defense first is permissible under the UN Charter and under any rational.
Well, actually, under the UN Charter, Israel would have to appeal to the Security Council. Preemptive strikes are without the authorization of the Security Council is illegal under international law. The only way preemptive strikes are legitimate, or the only way that preemptive strikes are legal, according to international law, is if you appeal to Article 7. Or Chapter 7 and get authorization from the Security Council, which Israel didn't do. Article 51 is the other way that a country can attack another country, but Article 51 specifically says you have to be under attack. Israel was not under attack in 1967. They're the ones who attacked first. And by the way, in April of 1967, the Israeli intelligence said that they don't expect Nasser to attack because he had most of his troops in Yemen at the time. So Israel knew that they weren't going to attack, and Israel knew that they weren't really under the threat of destruction. That's all propaganda. Israel knew that they'd be able to wipe out the Egyptian Air Force and the Syrian army within hours, which is exactly what they did. So
you're cherry-picking the information. There may have been, I'm not doubting that there was such a report. There were other such reports. You probably know that they were making plans to convert the largest park in Tel Aviv into a cemetery. There was no real question that the Israelis felt threatened and that they were right to feel threatened.
Well, actually, that's not true. I think it was Ben-Gurion said that Israel has not been under attacks, or Israel has not been under a threat since 1949. I mean, if you look at the declassified accounts, this is what good, like Tom Sakoff, he wrote a book called 1967, and he did a good job of documenting that that Israel really didn't feel as threatened as the propaganda makes you see. It's just like I don't know if you've been living in the United States your whole life, but the Americans were also afraid that this little country called Grenada, this little dot of an island, posed some kind of threat to its existence. And the reason why they did is because of a great propaganda system in the United States. And same with the 1967 war. The Israeli cabinet, Eshkol and Moshe Dayan, they knew that Israel would be able to murder the Egyptian airfields, and they did. They annihilated it within 3 hours or so. They knew that they were going to do that beforehand. Abba Eban, he admitted in his autobiography that, and I'm quoting him, he said Nasser did not want war. He wanted a political victory without war. And they knew that this was a great way to get rid of the main culprit of Egyptian nationalism, which was Nasser, and it worked. But at any rate, I do want to get back to what international law says about acquiring territory by force and how it's illegal to do so. And Security Council resolutions say that, so does the UN Charter, which Israel is supposed to adhere to. Now, saying that two wrongs make a right, I don't know if that's a really good argument, saying that Arab states did something, so Israel is allowed to violate international law too.
Well, but that's a very important point, because if you don't hold the Arabs to the same standard as Israel, if you single out Israel for criticism, you're using a double standard, and double standards are a form of delegitimization.
But nobody ever denied that the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War is debatable because they attacked Israel in territories that they should have withdrawn from in the first place. But the 1967 war, again, if you want to fight a war legally, you have to get if you want to fight a war preemptively, you have to get authorization from the Security Council, and Israel didn't do that. There's only two ways legally a country can fight a war. You get authorization from the Security Council, or self-defense, Article 51, which stipulates specifically you have to be under attack. And Israel was not, so that war, legally speaking, that Israel waged in 1967 was illegal. In the aftermath of it, UN Resolution 242, Israel just says, screw you, we're not going to withdraw from territories that we occupied during the war.
But that's false. Now, let's be clear. The Resolution 242 does not require withdrawal to the 1949 armistice lines. They wrote that very clearly and very specifically to say territories, not the territories. The extent of the withdrawal is governed by the rest of the resolution, which requires defensible borders and recognition of the rights of all the states. Has nothing to, by the way, and 242 has nothing to do with the Palestinians.
Really?
Only with the Jordanians.
Let me ask you a question. Who framed Resolution 242?
I believe, it was largely framed by the U.S. delegation to the UN, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, it was Lord Caradon. Lord Caradon of the United Kingdom framed the UN Resolution 242, and he's
one of the authors, but not the only one.
He's the main one. And he specifically said that the definite article, the territories, it was talking about the intent of 242 was to withdraw from a land that Israel acquired through force, which was the Gaza Strip, West Bank, Golan Heights, and the Sinai. And even the UN Secretary General U Thant reiterated the withdrawalness of Israel to the land that they acquired by force. Just about everybody, also in Abba Eban and Moshe Dayan, knew full well that UN 242 clearly indicated a move back to the pre-June 1967 borders. If you read some of their private memoirs, they exactly say that. Of course, what they say publicly doesn't usually coincide with what they say privately. There's a whole record on the United States saying why they're going to attack some country, and then when the records become declassified, there's a whole other reason why they do it. a more nefarious reason. It's the same thing with this one, too.
Well, private intentions may, look, one's private intentions may be one's genuine intentions, but the public record is what the legal texts mean. Some secret intention, or if Lord Carrington had some other secret or private idea of what it meant, that doesn't really matter.
They said that is what it means. They said that when the 242 says withdraw from territories occupied during the recent conflict, what territories were occupied during the recent conflict other than the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai?
Look, we have testimony of other participants who said the definite article was deliberately omitted precisely to not require withdrawal to the armistice lines. And the armistice lines, you have to remember, were not intended to be final borders for the Jewish state at the insistence of the Arabs, the Arab parties to the armistice in 1949.
Wait, so say
those are not permanent borders.
No, I'm sorry, my phone cut out for about like 3 seconds. Could you repeat what you just said? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Sorry.
It's important to remember that the armistice lines of 49, at the insistence of the Arabs, not Israel, were not intended to be the final permanent borders of the Jewish state. They are armistice lines. They are ceasefire lines. There is no permanent border to Israel's east at this time.
Exactly. That's why the definite article wasn't put in there, is because because those lines were vague. But that has nothing to do with the fact that Israel has to withdraw from territories that they recently occupied in the '67 war. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's exactly what Hugh Thant said when he explained why the definite article wasn't there in 242. It has nothing to do with the fact that Israel gets to keep the territories that they occupied, and the biggest evidence of that is the preamble of 242. It says that we emphasize the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. It wouldn't have said that if they're saying, okay, it's okay for Israel to keep some of the territories that they occupied. That was never the intent of 242. And they didn't want to have...
I don't find your interpretation very persuasive, because if you had
that's their interpretation, but just real quick, that's the interpretation of Lord Caradon, that's the interpretation of Hugh Thant, and that's even the interpretation of Abba Eban and Moshe Dayan.
I don't accept your claim that the Israelis took that to be the...
Privately, that's what they knew that's what it meant.
I understand what you're saying. I don't accept that as true without seeing it for myself.
Okay.
And plainly, there are different opinions about what it required. The claim, however, which I want to go back to, that if I understand what your argument, if it had said the territories, it would have been more vague or less clear than without the definite article. Makes no sense to me. If you wanted Israel to withdraw from all the territories, then putting the into the resolution would be better, not worse. So the point remains this, it seems to me. There's a resolution which Israel now accepts. Well, it's not that let me put it another way. It's not that Israel accepts or doesn't accept the resolution. Israel is trying to have a two-state solution, a partition of the land of Israel with the Palestinians. And Netanyahu is waiting at the door saying to Abbas, come negotiate with me, come. And Abbas is not coming.
Wait a minute. You can't really believe that, because Netanyahu sabotaged the peace talks when he stopped the moratorium for building settlements back in September of last year.
That's absolutely false. First of all, he put in a moratorium on settlements, a moratorium precisely at the request of the United States, at the request of the Palestinians, so that the Palestinians would come. They didn't come.
Yeah, they did. Wait. Yeah, they did. They moved. There were meetings.
10-month moratorium, and at the end of that time, the moratorium ended.
But the Palestinians said that they would negotiate, but Israel ended the moratorium and built settlements in September, and that's what sabotaged the whole peace meetings. The Palestinians said, Mahmoud Abbas said,
the moratorium expired of its own terms.
It expired, but they were going to renew it. Mahmoud Abbas, Hillary Clinton, and Netanyahu were starting peace talks, and Mahmoud Abbas said, you have to stop building settlements. We can't have good talks if you're building illegal settlements. And what we hope, number one, the settlements are illegal. Nobody denies that. And in February,
many people deny that.
Well, actually, the World Court says it is in 2004. So that's, and plus Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Conventions clearly says that building settlements in occupied territories is illegal. The 2004 court, even Judge Bergenthal of the United States, said that building settlements is contrary to international law. The only people who deny that is Israeli supporters. The whole world accepts that, even the United States. Except through, the Barack Obama vetoed a Security Council resolution in February, issued the sole veto of a Security Council resolution in February, saying that the settlements were legal. Their settlements were not illegal. He didn't say they were legal. He just said that they were not illegal. But nevertheless, that goes against even U.S. law supporting them to build the settlements. But that's why the peace talks were sabotaged back in September, is because Israel was building settlements in the West Bank, which was supposed to be the territory for the Palestinian state. Anyone would do the same thing. If you and I were 200 years ago, if we were Native Americans and we were negotiating with the United States, if they kept on building settlements in our territory, then yeah, that would disrupt the peace talks big time. Especially if it's written that it's against the law, and the whole world recognizes that it's against the law too.
I'll tell you why that isn't true. Israel has shown more than once that in exchange for peace, it will withdraw from settlements. It withdrew from the Sinai, including a large town of Yamit, to which Menachem Begin said, that's where I'm going to go when I retire. Mm-hmm. And it withdrew from Gaza, causing considerable pain within Israel when it evacuated the Jews living there. The settlements are not a problem. Well, they're not a big problem. They're not a big problem because
people's houses being bulldozed isn't a big problem?
Just a moment. Okay. The settlements are not a problem because if there's a peace treaty, they'll go. We know that. Israel has done that before. So the claim that they can keep or ought to keep the Palestinians from negotiating is fairly absurd. Come and talk, and we can talk about it. Just come and talk. The settlements will either stay or they'll go. They'll negotiate about it.
Okay, Israel has denied peace in favor of expansion numerous times. You brought up Menachem Begin. Wait, hold on a minute. You brought up Menachem Begin. There is one example. In February 1971, Anwar Sadat offered Golda Meir in exchange for a full withdrawal from the Sinai, and there would be peace. That's what Sadat offered in February 1971. And Israel denied that. They said, no, we're not going to negotiate that. And of course, 2 years later, there was war. And the reason there was war is because Israel was occupying territory that she was required to withdraw from. And what's interesting is in 1978, when they finally did reach the Camp David Accords between Sadat, Carter, and Begin, Israel and the United States offered almost exactly what Sadat offered before in February 1971. So there's a huge example. In 1973, Yom Kippur was really serious against Israel. Israel almost went out because of that war. Israel, it looked like they were going to be gone. And that could have all been avoided if they would have accepted Sadat's peace offer in February 1971. But Israel didn't. They denied it. And they offered the same thing in 1978 with the Camp David Accords. They accepted exactly what Sadat offered. In fact, they didn't. They would have been better accepting what he offered in 1971 because it had nothing to do with the Palestinians. The Camp David Accords in 78 did include the Palestinians. And by the way, just as a side note, when Israel made peace with Egypt in 1978, 1979, and when they officially made peace, I should say, in 94 with Jordan, they didn't say that they had to accept their, quote, legitimacy. They just had to accept their existence. And again, all the major parties accept Israel's existence. Accepting a two-state settlement by definition, that's accepting their existence. And another quick point, the withdrawal from Gaza was just a point to expand settlements in the West Bank, which is illegal too. The reason why they withdrew from Gaza is because Israel figured that it's pointless to keep 8,000 settlers in Gaza with a huge chunk of the Israeli army protecting them when they could just move them in the West Bank. It was economically and politically advantageous for them to do that. So, and plus, I mean, Gazans don't have any type of autonomy. Their borders are controlled by Israel. Their economy is basically controlled by Israel, and they're basically in a prison in Gaza. Hello?
Well, that was quite a rant.
I didn't mean to rant. I just want to contradict the notion that Israel has always accepts, oh, come on, let's talk, there will be peace. No, Israel has denied talking dozens of times in favor of expansion. They can get peace right. Israel can have peace tomorrow if they withdraw from the occupied territories. The Arab League has, especially the Saudi Arabian plan in 2002, they said that we'll not only recognize you, Israel, we'll increase trade with you, Israel, just get out of territories that you're supposed to have been gotten out of 43 years ago. That's all we want you to do. And Israel says no. They want expansion.
That's false. If you're ignoring the substantial number of Palestinians who, because they don't recognize the legitimacy of Israel, the legitimacy of a Jewish state, for nationalist and for religious reasons, would continue to wage war against Israel if Israel withdrew to the armistice lines.
But under international law, nobody's required to accept their legitimacy.
Just a moment. We're talking about whether there would be peace.
Mm-hmm.
Are you changing your mind about that?
Of course not.
Okay. All right. So your claim is, if Israel withdrew tomorrow to the 1949 armistice lines, there would be. Your claim is, and then there would be peace.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right.
You believe that?
Yes, I do.
You believe that Hamas would not wage war against Israel?
Yeah, and another reason is, just as an example, from June the 17th to November 4th in 2008, Hamas abided by a ceasefire. It's Israel that broke it. Hamas, even the top Hamas leadership has publicly accepted the two-state settlement. They've joined the international community, the whole world on that. Again, it's the U.S. and Israel. Look at what Israel is doing now to sabotage Palestinian statehood.
Anton, I'm trying to have a reality-based conversation with you. But
Me too.
If you insist that Hamas will accept the existence of Israel, we're at a bit of an impasse. It's simply not only not true, it's nothing like the reality that we live in.
Okay.
If you don't recognize the substantial hostility against Israel, not because of its borders, but because of its existence.
Mm-hmm.
No, look. The existence of Israel is regarded as an insult, a mortal insult, by many, many Arabs and Muslims.
That's why they don't accept their legitimacy, but they'll accept their existence.
No,
they're not going to accept their legitimacy, because accepting their legitimacy would be saying that, yes, it's okay that you ethnically cleansed us back in 1948-49. That's okay that you did that, and that's okay that you're setting up a Jewish state, even though there's 20% non-Jews in Israel. Accepting the legitimacy would be asking too much. They already accept their existence, which is what they were originally compelled to do, and now that they've done that, they not only have to accept their existence, they have to accept their legitimacy, they have to accept the fact that they're a Jewish state, never mind that they have 20% non-Jews. Yeah, they're upping the ante purposely so they don't have to negotiate and create a Palestinian state.
No, what's actually true is this. Because they don't recognize, too many Palestinians don't recognize the legitimacy of Israel, they would not recognize its existence in the sense of leaving it alone, leaving it in peace.
I don't accept that. I accept what the Arabs have been saying for decades now. And that's
in English
it will get
only. In Arabic, they have the most blood-curdling threats against Israel.
And you know what? They said the same.
You're unaware of it.
They said the same thing about Egypt. They said that a peace settlement will never work. Guess what? In 1978, it worked. They said that it wouldn't. They said you shouldn't do it because those crazy Egyptians don't want peace. Yeah, they do. They want peace. The same thing with the Jordans. The same thing with the Lebanese. They just want their territory back.
You're cherry picking again. There's substantial hostility against Israel.
But there's hostility of Israel against a Palestinian state, too. If you're saying that you shouldn't negotiate with these so-called terrorists because they don't accept your existence, then no Palestinian should ever negotiate with Israel, because Israel is dedicated to the non-establishment of any type of Palestinian state, as they've proved time and time again, voting against General Assembly resolutions one after another for decades now. They are committed not to accept a Palestinian state.
This is really looking glass logic, because Netanyahu said, I think as recently as 5 days ago, come negotiate. Everything is on the table. Come. If you want to prove him wrong, then come. But you don't prove him wrong by not negotiating.
Yeah, and they have. And again, negotiations got sabotaged because Israel kept on building illegal settlements.
Well, the settlements are not illegal.
Under international law, they are. No. And according to the World Court, they are. Do you disagree with the World Court?
Yes.
All of them? All 15 members of the World Court you disagree with when they voted in 2004? You disagree with every single one of them?
I would have to review their decision and review what they really said and review their reasoning.
You don't have to, but you could trust me on this one. In 2004, all 15, it wasn't close. You might have a leg to stand on if it was like 7-8, but it was all 15 states of the World Court agreed that the settlements are illegal. They contradict Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Conventions. All of them said that.
Now, that's the decision about the security fence, right?
Exactly, but they said in all their concurrences that they mentioned in their concurrences too that the settlements themselves were illegal. Even in 1967, the Israeli, again privately, the Israelis said that privately that we know that the settlements are illegal, but heck, all states do things illegal, so we may as well do it too. They admitted too, behind closed doors, that the settlements were illegal. So keep pressing the point. We do have to go in a minute or two. I do want to thank you for putting up with me, Paul. You're a good sport, and I really appreciate it too.
You're welcome.